This is the second video for Unit 10. It includes Part C, how do skeletal muscles work, and Part D, smooth muscle. Part C has several subdivisions. We'll look at the mechanism of contraction. We'll look at where the energy comes from. We'll look at those factors that affect strength of contraction. And then we'll look at the actions of whole muscles. Let's look at the mechanism of contraction. Sliding filaments. The thick filaments slide across the thin filaments. As the filaments slide, the light bands become narrower and the dark bands become wider. Here's a view of a muscle in the relaxed, elongated state. You can see the dark band is narrow, the light band is wide. When the muscle contracts and shortens, the dark bands become wider and the light bands become narrower. In the relaxed, elongated muscle, the overlap of the thin and thick filaments is less. In the contracted muscle, the overlap of the thick and thin filaments is greater. Let's look at how the sliding filaments work. Cross bridges on the myosin molecules bind to the myosin binding site on the actin. They automatically bend. This is the power stroke, and it causes the actin to slide. The ATP then binds to the ATP binding site on the cross bridge, and that allows the cross bridge to be released from the actin molecule. The ATP then splits into ADP and phosphate, and when that happens, the recovery stroke occurs. The cross bridge snaps back into its original position. What is rigor mortis? Rigor mortis is the state of muscles after death. They become rigid because as the ATP has run out, the cross bridges can't be released from the actin, and the muscles are locked in whatever state they were in when death occurred. What turns the sliding on? When a muscle is relaxed, the myosin binding site on the actin is covered by the tropomyosin. The nerve impulse, also called an action potential, travels down the neuron and reaches the tip and releases a neurotransmitter at the neuromuscular junction. The neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. Now what we have here is cell communication. The nerve cell is communicating chemically with the muscle cell. The acetylcholine binds to receptors on the muscle cell, and a muscle cell potential is generated. The impulse travels down the membrane of the muscle cell, and it travels down the T-tubule into the interior of the muscle cell. The impulse acts on voltage-gated calcium channels to increase permeability of the lateral sacs for calcium ions. Now, because the lateral sacs are filled with calcium ions, there is a gradient between the inside and the outside, and the calcium diffuses out of the lateral sac down its concentration gradient. The calcium acts as a trigger. It binds with the troponin, causing the troponin to swing the tropomyosin away from the binding site, uncovering the binding site so that the process can start all over again. This is called excitation-contraction coupling. You remember when we talked about cell-to-cell communication? We said that there are many second messengers inside the cell, transmitting the impulse from the surface of the cell to a site of action. Well, that's a role of the calcium ions in this example, transmitting the information from the lateral sacs to the troponin. Turns the sliding off. Note that when the myosin binding site on the actin is uncovered, binding will automatically occur. Calcium ions are pumped back into the lateral sac. This is by carrier-mediated transport, and so it requires ATP. Tropomyosin then flips back down and covers the binding site, preventing the cross bridges from binding. So that would turn the sliding off. Skeletal muscles become weaker without a synaptic communication, that is, without the nerve hookup. You know of the expression, use it or lose it. Not really understood why this is the case. ATP is required to protect and bend the cross bridges, to release the cross bridges, and to transport calcium back into the lateral sac. Muscle work includes everything the muscle does that requires energy. Muscles convert 20% of their energy to work and 80% to heat. As work increases, the oxygen consumption by the muscles increases. Eventually, work can continue to increase, although oxygen consumption does not increase further. An oxygen debt results. Remember, cellular respiration is an aerobic process, that is, it requires oxygen, and fermentation is an anaerobic process. It does not use oxygen. Let's see what this diagram shows. Muscle work includes all those processes that require energy: contraction, relaxation, pumping calcium into the lateral sacs, and so forth. Creatine phosphate is a molecule that stores a small amount of energy. The energy can be supplied immediately and quickly. Major suppliers of energy are glucose and fatty acids. The Krebs cycle and the electron transport system generate a lot of energy. The electron transport system requires oxygen. Where does it come from? Breathing, and also from a molecule called myoglobin, which is very similar to hemoglobin. It's what gives the red color to roast beef. Sources of glucose and fatty acids include muscle glycogen, which is broken down into glucose, blood-borne fatty acids, and glucose that are transported to the muscles in the blood from other sources, and muscle fat. Sources of ATP include, number one, a direct supply of ATP. This supply is roughly 10 seconds worth of energy if the muscle depended only on that source. Now, this scheme will be divided into steps. That's a little misleading because it sounds like step one will occur, and when it's done, then step two occurs, and so forth. And it doesn't really work that way. Step one does start, but before it ends, step two begins, and step three before two ends, and so forth. Nevertheless, dividing this into discrete steps is a useful frame of reference. Step two would be creatine phosphate, that supplies roughly 10 seconds worth of energy. It does so by allowing ATP to be regenerated from ADP. Creatine phosphate, sometimes called the phosphagen system, is generated by an enzyme called creatine phosphokinase. It exists in three forms: the MM form in skeletal muscle, the BB form in the central nervous system, and the MB form in cardiac muscle. Following a heart attack, elevated levels of creatine phosphokinase may exist, but it has to be the MB form. The heart attack has ruptured the cells and allowed some of the enzymes to escape. Number three is anaerobic generation of energy from glycolysis, that is, the breakdown of glucose to pyruvic acid. If that was the sole source of energy, that would supply roughly 50 seconds worth of energy. Glucose comes from muscle glycogen that's stored within the muscle and transported in by the blood. Pyruvic acid may become lactic acid, the glycogen lactic acid system. Lactic acid is transported to the liver and changed into glucose. Pyruvic acid may enter the Krebs cycle if oxygen is present. Number 4, aerobic from muscle glycogen supplies roughly 90 minutes worth of energy. So you see that's a great source of energy. It requires the Krebs cycle and the electron transport system. It may begin with glycolysis from the glucose. It requires oxygen, as mentioned earlier, and it comes from breathing and from myoglobin. It generates carbon dioxide as a waste product. Then number 5, aerobic from muscle fat alone. Number 6 would be aerobic from blood-borne fatty acids and glucose. This supplies roughly 10 to 40 minutes worth of energy. Number 7 then would be aerobic from blood-borne fatty acids alone. Notice that the energy needs of muscles increase as glucose use decreases. The reason for that is glucose must be conserved for the nervous system because the nervous system depends on glucose for its energy. Where does the blood-borne fatty acids come from? Adipose tissue. Roughly how many minutes of exercise, then, are required before adipose tissue breaks down to supply energy? Roughly an hour and a half. What about an oxygen debt? This is the oxygen needed after muscle work to replace oxygen reserves, to generate creatine phosphate, to oxidize, that is, to remove the lactic acid that's built up. Generates ATP needed for other metabolic processes following the muscle work. Aerobic metabolism, cellular respiration, can generate roughly 38 molecules of ATP per glucose molecule, whereas anaerobic metabolism, glycolysis, will generate 2 molecules of ATP from 1 glucose molecule. But anaerobic metabolism can produce ATP fast because fewer steps are involved and oxygen doesn't have to be transported in. So it's used to generate quick bursts of energy. There are 2 categories of muscle fibers with respect to the source of energy. Fast twitch fibers, also called white or type 2, use anaerobic metabolism to generate muscle. It generates energy fast because fewer steps are involved. The flight muscles of birds, for example, chicken breast meat, is white. The other type of fibers are the slow twitch fibers, red or type 1. These generate energy for long periods of time by aerobic metabolism. Leg muscles of birds, the chicken drumstick, for example, and the red meat that we eat, beef and pork and so forth. It's red in color because of the presence of the myoglobin. Let's look at 2 kinds of elements in muscle. These are contractile and non-contractile. It's important to distinguish between the contractile and non-contractile elements to understand how muscles work. Contractile elements are the thick and thin filaments that do the contracting. They slide across one another. The non-contractile elements are usually elastic. These are the remaining structures. They include connective tissue in the muscle, blood vessels, fat, cell structures. Let's look at a model of a muscle made of wood, represented by B. Thick and thin filaments are shown as the bright orange and blue rods. These are the contractile elements. The springs represent all of the non-contractile elements. These are elastic. What structure is represented by the arrow A? A sarcomere. So we're looking at a muscle with one sarcomere. Now, the active state is the state of muscle contraction. Tension is the force of stretching. There may be internal tension and there may be external tension. Internal tension stretches the elastic elements. External tension is exerted on the load. That's what the insertion is attached to. In this model, the origin is not movable because it is attached to the base. The insertion is movable. In the active state, the thick and thin filaments slide. Parts C and D are pulled closer together. The springs stretch, creating internal tension. With enough tension, the insertion will be pulled, creating the external tension. Compare this to attaching a rubber band to a weight. When you pull up on the rubber band, the first thing it does is just stretch. Only when it stretches enough, that is, creates enough tension, does it lift the object off the tabletop. There are two types of contraction, isometric and isotonic. Isometric means same length. The muscle does not change length. The muscle does change its tension. Isotonic means same tension. The muscle does not change its tension, but it does change its length. Let's look at isometric contractions. The length is constant, but the tension changes. Hold the insertion so it can't move. The length of the muscle, therefore, is constant. Slide the thick and thin filaments. What does this do to the springs? It causes them to stretch. Does the muscle change length? No, because you're holding the insertion steady. To lift a 10-pound milk jug, grasp the jug and start generating tension. Since the jug weighs 10 pounds, the muscle has to generate 10 pounds of tension before the jug is lifted. Notice the muscle is not shortening during this attempt. Isotonic contraction. Tension is constant, the length changes. Prior to contraction, the muscle is generating 0 pounds of tension. When undergoing contraction, the tension increases. That is, the springs are stretched. How much tension must the muscle create to lift the 10-pound milk jug? 10 pounds of tension. Once 10 pounds of tension is achieved, the jug begins to lift. As the milk jug is being lifted, obviously the muscle is shortening. So this is an isotonic contraction. What's happening to the tension? It stays the same. 10 pounds of tension, because that's what the jug weighs. It doesn't change its weight. Almost every action we do is a combination of isometric and isotonic contractions. Motor unit is a group of muscle fibers innervated by a single neuron. The nerve impulse is transmitted along the neuron and transmitted equally to all branches of that neuron. So the motor unit will contract all at once. If it doesn't receive nerve impulses, it won't contract at all. There's no such thing as a half contraction of a motor unit. We call this the all or none contraction. A muscle twitch is a single contraction of a motor unit. To understand that, let's look at an experimental setup. Originally, the frog gastrocnemius muscle was used. Fortunately, the entire muscle is a single motor unit. The muscle is carefully removed along with a motor nerve. A load is attached to the muscle. The nerve is stimulated with an electric shock. A nerve impulse stimulates the muscle to contract. Let's look at muscle actions. A muscle twitch begins when the stimulus causes the thick and thin filaments to slide across one another. It has three parts: the latent period, in which the muscle does not change length; the contraction period, in which the muscle shortens; and the relaxation period, in which the muscle relaxes and, due to the weight, elongates. Which periods must the thick and thin filaments slide to generate tension? The latent and contraction periods. Remember, in the latent period, sliding filaments does occur, but it simply stretches the internal components, the elastic components. In which periods is the muscle changing length? Contraction and relaxation periods. Now, of course, during the relaxation period, in the setup we describe, elongation occurs because of the weight pulling the muscle long after it has relaxed. If there was no weight attached to it, the muscle may not elongate. But of course, in real life, muscles work, as you know, in antagonistic pairs. Which period is energy required? All three. In the latent and contraction periods, filaments are sliding. In the relaxation period, ATP is necessary to unhinge the binding sites. Is the latent period an isometric or isotonic contraction? It's an isometric contraction, no change in length. How does a muscle vary the strength of contraction? By adding muscle twitches. Few muscle twitches would give a weak contraction. A lot of muscle twitches would give a stronger contraction. Sum means to add. Therefore, in muscle physiology, summation means to add muscle twitches. There are two types: multiple motor unit summation, also called spatial summation, because the motor units are separated by space, by distance. It's a contraction of more than one motor unit at the same time. The other is wave summation, also called temporal summation, because the stimuli are separated in time. Here's what we mean: a repeated contraction of a single motor unit before it can relax completely. One stimulus occurs, and a short fraction of a second later, a second stimulus, a fraction of a second later, the third stimulus, for example. The impulses arrive at different times due to increased frequency of impulses to the motor unit. When a muscle is stimulated at a low frequency, the contractions take the form of individual twitches. If the frequency of stimulation increases, the result is tetanus, that is, unfused or fused contraction. Tetanus is a sustained contraction of a muscle. Conus, on the other hand, is a constant partial contraction of a muscle. Crepi is a stronger contraction after the second stimulus. Up to a point, the stronger the stimulus, the greater the muscle contracts. Eventually, a muscle reaches a maximum contraction even when the stimulus strength is increased. This occurs when all motor units contract. A nerve, shown in cross-section below, contains many neurons, each of which supplies a motor unit. When a nerve is stimulated with an electric shock, neurons are stimulated. The stronger the stimulus, the more neurons transmit nerve impulses, and the more motor units contract. A weak stimulus might activate 2 neurons, for example. A stronger stimulus might activate 10 neurons. Eventually, all the neurons and the motor units they supply are stimulated to a stronger stimulus, contract, and a stronger stimulus will not increase the muscle contraction. There are several factors that affect the strength of contraction. One is the physiological state, such as the previous stimulus. If the stimulus occurs shortly after a previous, the contraction is a little stronger. Wave summation. The energy availability. If ATP runs low, the contraction becomes weaker. Presence of waste products. If lactic acid or CO2 build up, the contractions may become weaker. And the length of the muscle prior to stimulation. Now, this is an important concept, and we'll come back to this when we get to the physiology of the heart. Maximum binding, that is, maximum overlap of thick and thin filaments, equals maximum force of contraction, that is, maximum tension. The more cross bridges that are bound, the greater the strength of contraction. Compare this to a tug of war with two teams. The more hands on the rope, the stronger the team can pull. If the muscle prior to stimulation is overly contracted or overly elongated, fewer cross bridges are bound. In both examples, you see two cross bridges bound to the binding sites. Contraction is weaker. We might say it's two cross bridges worth. But in an intermediate state of length, I call this maximum overlap, more cross bridges are bound. In the example, 4 cross bridges are bound, and the muscle can generate greater strength of contraction. Part D is a brief look at smooth muscle. Smooth muscle differs from skeletal muscle in certain ways. It's the primary feature of the visceral component of the body. Smooth muscle contracts when stimulated by the nervous system or by hormones, or it may contract spontaneously. Smooth muscle exhibits a slow response, a slow contraction. It generates less strength of contraction. Smooth muscle exhibits greater elasticity. It's very stretchable. Calcium enters the smooth muscle cells from the extracellular fluid. What would you expect an increase in extracellular calcium do to smooth muscle contraction? Increase it. Thin filaments attach to dense bodies. They function like the Z-lines in skeletal muscle. Types of smooth muscle include multi-unit. Each cell responds individually. Examples include all smooth muscle in the large arteries, some of the smooth muscle in the intestines, reproductive organs, and the erector pili muscles of the skin. Unitary smooth muscle, also referred to as visceral or single unit, smooth muscle cells are joined at gap junctions, so they all act as one. Smooth muscle cells act together, usually in a rhythmic manner. Examples include small arteries, small veins, most smooth muscle in the intestines, uterus, and the respiratory system. Also the urinary system. And that is the end of muscle. You're ready now to progress to Unit 11, cells of the nervous system.